The scorching summer sun hung high over Fort Ridge, Georgia, casting a relentless heat that shimmered off the asphalt roads and bleached training fields. The morning air was thick and humid, wrapping around the soldiers like a heavy, damp blanket. Sweat beaded on their skin, rolling down in rivulets as they pounded across the field in synchronized strides. Boots struck the dirt with rhythmic precision, the sound swallowed by the buzzing of cicadas in the towering pines that lined the perimeter of the base. Among the ranks of recruits was Darius Holloway, a 22-year-old African-American man from the heart of Atlanta. His lean, muscular frame moved with practiced determination, his breathing steady despite the heat pressing down on him. The sun glistened against his dark skin, highlighting the taut muscles in his arms and legs as he pushed himself forward, never faltering in his pace. He wasn't the fastest, but he was relentless, his focus unshakable. Every step he took was driven by a singular goal, to make something of himself, to prove his worth in a world that often dismissed young black men like him. Darius had grown up watching his father's military career shape the structure of their household. His father had been a disciplined man, firm but fair, his words often carrying the weight of command even when he was home. His grandfather's stories of Vietnam had painted a picture of service and sacrifice, of camaraderie forged in the fires of war. For Darius, the military wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a path to stability, to something greater than himself. His younger brothers still lived in the same struggling neighborhood he had fought to escape. If he succeeded here, he could set an example, prove that there was a way out, a way forward. But Fort Ridge was proving to be an unforgiving place. Training was grueling, the standards unyielding. Every day was a battle against exhaustion, against the limits of his body and mind. The drill instructors were relentless, pushing the recruits past their breaking points, barking orders that had to be obeyed without hesitation. There was no room for weakness. Every failed exercise, every missed command, was met with extra drills, longer runs, and harder punishments. Darius thrived under the pressure. He was strong, resilient, unwilling to let his body betray him. Where others faltered, he grit his teeth and pushed forward. His ability to endure did not go unnoticed. Within weeks, he had caught the eye of Major Gerald Westbrook, the commanding officer overseeing the training program. Westbrook was a man of stature, his uniform always pressed to perfection, his posture straight-backed and authoritative. His sharp blue eyes missed nothing, scanning the recruits like a predator sizing up its prey. He had a reputation, an officer who valued discipline above all else, who held his soldiers to impossible standards and demanded nothing short of excellence. Some feared him, others respected him, but no one ignored him. It started subtly at first. Westbrook would call Darius out during drills, acknowledging his perseverance with a nod of approval or a rare, measured word of praise. Then came the individual assignments, tasks that separated him from his fellow recruits, special duties that required him to report to the major's office for debriefings. Westbrook would inspect his performance with a keen eye, flipping through reports, questioning his decisions during exercises. It felt like recognition, a sign that he was on the right path. Soon, the major's attention became more direct. His hands lingered too long on Darius's shoulder during training exercises, his gaze felt too intent. During instructional briefings, Westbrook positioned himself just close enough that Darius could feel the heat of his breath when he spoke. It wasn't overt, wasn't enough to raise alarms, but the unease crept in, slow and insidious. Darius tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to paranoia, to nerves. He had worked too hard to let discomfort cloud his focus. But the instances became more frequent, more calculated. Westbrook would correct his stance during drills, his hands pressing firmly against Darius's lower back, his grip lingering under the pretense of instruction. He would assign late-night review sessions, keeping Darius in his office long after other recruits had been dismissed, offering advice, discussing his potential, always finding ways to make him stay just a little longer. There was a shift in the way the major spoke to him. The firm, measured tone he used with other soldiers softened when they were alone. Compliments became personal, delivered with an intensity that felt out of place. The once professional distance between them had been replaced by something suffocating, something that made Darius's skin prickle with unease. But he didn't say anything. He couldn't. This was his career, his future. To speak out against an officer of Westbrook's rank was to invite scrutiny, doubt, and potential ruin. Darius had seen it happen before, soldiers who had whispered complaints about misconduct only to find themselves reassigned, their records suddenly marred by vague disciplinary infractions. The system protected its own. To accuse a superior was to paint himself as a problem, as someone who couldn't handle the pressures of military life. So he kept his head down. He did what was asked of him. He endured. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before endurance wouldn't be enough. Darius moved through the ranks of his training program with remarkable speed. He had proven himself to be not only physically capable but mentally resilient, able to endure pressure and execute orders with precision. His instructors took notice, but more importantly, Major Westbrook did. The Major's approval seemed to carry more weight than that of anyone else on base. When Westbrook acknowledged a soldier's potential, it usually meant good things were ahead, special assignments, accelerated promotions, and access to career paths that most recruits could only hope for. At first, Darius felt nothing but pride. He had worked tirelessly for this recognition, and if it meant extra duties or late-night strategy sessions, he was willing to push himself. He knew he was being tested, and passing Westbrook's scrutiny could open doors for him. But that pride soon soured into unease as he realized that the Major's attention was not simply about his performance. Westbrook began finding excuses to summon him to his office outside of normal hours. The assignments he gave were vague, sometimes nothing more than reviewing documents that he claimed required a second opinion, sometimes discussing leadership strategies that didn't seem to apply to a recruit at Darius's level. These meetings stretched late into the night, and each time, the room felt smaller, the air thicker, the Major's presence more suffocating. During physical training, Westbrook would pull Darius aside for corrections that required touch, a hand on his shoulder, a firm grip at the small of his back, a lingering press on his arm to demonstrate a stance. At first, Darius told himself that this was normal. Physical training required adjustments. Officers corrected their soldiers all the time. But then came the moments that weren't corrections at all, Westbrook standing just a little too close, his breath felt against Darius's neck as he whispered something meant only for him, his hands resting longer than necessary. Darius tried to rationalize it. The Major was strict but charismatic, a leader known for getting results. Maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe he was misreading the situation. But his body knew what his mind tried to deny. Every muscle tensed whenever Westbrook entered the room. Every nerve in his body was on high alert whenever the Major's eyes lingered on him. One evening, during an after-hours training session, the Major called him into the gym. The place was empty, the sound of his boots echoing against the high ceilings. Darius assumed it would be another of Westbrook's one-on-one drills, something to push him further, test his discipline. The Major leaned casually against the pull-up bar as Darius approached, his expression unreadable. Westbrook spoke of Darius's potential, of the career he could have if he followed the right paths. His tone was smooth, calculated, every word spoken like a promise. Then he placed a firm hand on Darius's shoulder. The grip was steady, slightly tighter than before. Darius froze. His instinct screamed at him to move, to step away, but he didn't. He forced himself to stand still, to keep his breathing even. He knew that any visible sign of discomfort could be turned against him. If he pulled away, if he reacted, it could be seen as insubordination. The military had strict codes of conduct, but everyone knew how things really worked. An officer's word carried more weight than a recruit's. From that night forward, things escalated. Westbrook no longer made an effort to be subtle. During night shifts, he found reasons to be near Darius. He would brush against him in narrow hallways, lean too close when looking over reports, touch his back under the guise of casual gestures. During meetings, his fingers would graze Darius's wrist when handing him papers, his palm pressing against his lower back when guiding him out of the room. Darius knew what was happening, but he had no way to stop it. Complaints against officers of Westbrook's rank rarely led to consequences for them. Instead, it was the accusers who suffered. Soldiers who had spoken out in the past found themselves transferred to distant, undesirable locations, their service records suddenly filled with disciplinary notes. Some were discharged for vague reasons, failure to adapt, conduct unbecoming. No one openly said what had happened to them, but everyone knew. Darius could already see how the story would unfold if he tried to fight back. Westbrook would deny everything, accuse him of lying, of misinterpreting his intentions. He had no proof. No witnesses. And Westbrook was careful. He never left anything in writing, never said anything explicit in front of others. It would be Darius's word against that of a decorated officer. The real trap closed around him late one night when he was called into Westbrook's office after lights out. The summons had come without warning, and Darius's stomach twisted as he made his way across the base. The halls were quiet at this hour, most of the other recruits already asleep. When he entered the office, Westbrook closed the door behind him, turning the lock with an audible click. Darius stiffened. The major poured himself a drink from the bottle on his desk, then offered a second glass. Darius declined. He didn't trust himself to hold it without his hands shaking. Westbrook stepped closer, setting the untouched drink down before resting one hand on Darius's shoulder. His fingers trailed up, brushing the side of his neck, then moved downward, grazing against the fabric of his uniform. Darius's breath caught in his throat. His entire body tensed, every muscle coiled. Westbrook whispered something, low, deliberate, promising. His other hand moved lower, fingertips brushing over Darius's waistband. Darius's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear anything else. His skin crawled at the contact, but his mind was frozen between fear and fury. Westbrook didn't stop. His grip tightened, his movements bolder. Darius clenched his teeth, every instinct in him screaming to shove the man away, to fight back. But he couldn't. He knew what would happen if he did. If he resisted, Westbrook would turn it against him. He would say that Darius had attacked him, that he had lashed out against a superior officer. There would be no trial, no justice, just an immediate end to his career and a dishonorable discharge. He felt trapped in his own body, paralyzed by the impossible weight of the situation. Westbrook's breath was hot against his skin, his grip tightening. Darius forced himself to remain still, his body rigid with the effort of suppressing every instinct that told him to run. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breathing shallow, waiting for it to end. When it was over, when Westbrook finally stepped back, there was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a slow, knowing smirk. Darius left the office in silence, his mind numb, his stomach twisting with nausea. He knew then that it wouldn't stop. That it would only get worse. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Darius had begun to live in a constant state of vigilance. Every day felt like a test of endurance, not just physically, but mentally. He moved through the base with calculated precision, avoiding hallways where he knew Major Westbrook often walked, choosing seats at the far end of the mess hall, and volunteering for duties that would keep him out of the Major's sight. But no matter how careful he was, Westbrook always found a way to remind him that escape was impossible. The summons to the Major's office became more frequent, though they rarely had a legitimate purpose. Sometimes, Westbrook barely spoke to him at all, merely watching as Darius stood at attention before dismissing him with a smirk. Other times, the conversations were filled with unspoken threats, veiled under a pretense of career advice. Westbrook was growing frustrated. Darius could see it in the way the man's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk, and the flicker of irritation that flashed across his expression when Darius answered him with only brief, professional responses. Training sessions became unbearable. If Darius was assigned to a group, Westbrook always found a way to single him out, forcing him into one-on-one drills that involved unnecessary touches, hands lingering under the guise of adjusting his form. During night patrols, Westbrook would appear out of nowhere, shadowing Darius under the dim glow of the base's floodlights, speaking in a low voice about the importance of loyalty. Darius tried to talk to someone about it. One evening, in the dimly lit barracks, he sat on his bunk, hands clenched into fists, and told his closest friend, Private Marcus Hill, about what had been happening. Marcus listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Darius finally stopped, waiting for a reaction, Marcus let out a slow breath and shook his head. There was nothing to be done. Everyone knew how the military worked. If Darius went to the higher-ups, it would be his word against the majors, and Westbrook had built a career on the loyalty of those beneath him. Accusations like these never made it past the first layer of command. Complaints disappeared, and the soldiers who filed them often found themselves discharged under vague allegations of misconduct. Marcus didn't need to say it, Darius already knew. The system was designed to protect men like Westbrook. The breaking point came on a night that should have been like any other. The barracks were quiet, the air thick with the scent of sweat and metal. Darius had just finished his evening shift and was preparing to collapse onto his bunk when a voice called his name from the doorway. One of the officers stood there, face impassive, telling him that Major Westbrook needed to see him. Darius felt the familiar weight of dread settle in his stomach, but he forced himself to move, his body operating on autopilot as he made his way through the darkened corridors toward the major's office. The base was quieter at this hour, most soldiers either asleep or on patrol. The shadows stretched long across the floor as he reached the door, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before pushing it open. Westbrook was waiting inside. The room was dimly lit, a single desk lamp casting a pool of yellow light across the wooden surface. The major wasn't in uniform. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up, the top buttons of his shirt undone. A glass of whiskey sat untouched beside his paperwork. Darius stood at attention, every muscle in his body coiled tight, his breath slow and measured. Westbrook leaned back in his chair, watching him for a long moment before standing. He moved around the desk with deliberate slowness, his polished boots making no sound against the floor. There was something different in his posture tonight, less patient, more aggressive. He had grown tired of waiting. The first touch was to Darius's arm, fingers trailing down his bicep in a mockery of reassurance. Then a hand settled on his chest, pressing lightly against the fabric of his uniform before moving downward. Darius tensed, every fiber of his being screaming at him to react, but he stayed still, his mind racing through the possibilities. If he pushed the major away, there would be consequences. If he fought back, he would be the one punished. Westbrook moved closer, the heat of his breath just inches from Darius's ear. His grip tightened as he shoved Darius backward against the desk, his hands moving with the certainty of a man who had done this before. There were no more words, no more pretense. Darius snapped. The explosion of rage was instantaneous, a raw, uncontrollable force that surged through his veins. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, instincts taking over as he shoved Westbrook back with all his strength. The major stumbled, but he was stronger, faster. He recovered quickly, his expression twisting with fury as he grabbed Darius by the collar, slamming him against the edge of the desk. Darius's vision blurred with adrenaline. His pulse pounded in his ears, deafening. Westbrook reached for him again, fingers curling into the fabric of his uniform, and Darius acted without thinking. His hand shot toward the major's waist, grasping the cold metal of the service pistol holstered at his side. The weapon came free in an instant. For the briefest of moments, everything was silent. Then a gunshot shattered the stillness. Westbrook jerked backward, eyes wide with shock. A dark stain spread rapidly across his chest. A second shot rang out, the bullet slamming into his ribcage. He staggered, his body hitting the edge of the desk before collapsing to the floor. Darius stood frozen, the gun still gripped in his shaking hands. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air, thick and metallic. The weight of what he had just done crashed over him like a tidal wave. Westbrook lay motionless, his breath ragged and uneven. His eyes flickered, his mouth opening slightly as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. Darius took a step back, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might burst. Outside, the distant sound of boots echoed through the hallways. Someone had heard the shots. The door burst open. Armed officers stormed inside, weapons drawn, their voices sharp and commanding. Darius didn't move. He let the pistol slip from his fingers, the metal clattering against the floor. His body felt distant, disconnected from reality. The moment was over. And there was no turning back. The moment the second shot echoed through the office, the air seemed to freeze. The acrid scent of gunpowder hung heavy, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Darius stood motionless, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of the service pistol still pressing against his palm. His fingers trembled around the grip, his knuckles white from the tension. Westbrook lay sprawled on the floor, his chest rising and falling in uneven, shallow breaths. The deep red of his blood spread across the linoleum, seeping into the fibers of the rug beneath him. The silence didn't last. The thudding of boots pounded through the hallway, rapid and urgent. Shouts rang out, sharp commands barking orders. The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, shaking the framed certificates and awards that lined the office. A group of military police officers flooded inside, weapons drawn, their eyes scanning the scene with quick, practiced efficiency. Darius didn't resist. He couldn't. His mind was still trying to process what had just happened, but his body refused to move. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the floor, the sound far too loud in the heavy stillness. For a split second, none of the officers reacted. They hesitated, as if their brains struggled to reconcile what they were seeing, an enlisted soldier standing over a high-ranking officer, a gun at his feet, blood pooling on the ground. Then they moved. One of them surged forward, slamming Darius to the floor with brute force. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs. His cheek scraped against the hard linoleum, the cold sting barely registering as his arms were yanked behind his back. The sharp bite of metal cut into his wrists as the handcuffs snapped shut. Knees pressed against his back, pinning him down, keeping him still. Shouting filled the room, a tangle of voices demanding explanations, issuing commands. Someone checked Westbrook's pulse. Others surrounded Darius, their grips firm and unyielding. His heart pounded against his ribs, the rush of adrenaline making his limbs feel numb. They dragged him to his feet. The world around him blurred, spinning as if he were watching from a distance, detached from his own body. He barely noticed when they shoved him forward, pushing him through the doorway and into the hallway beyond. The corridor was filled with people. Soldiers who had heard the commotion stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. Officers whispered to each other, their expressions unreadable. No one spoke to Darius. No one asked him why. He didn't need to hear their words to know what they were thinking. A soldier had shot his commanding officer. That alone was all that mattered. As he was led down the hall, the whispers followed him. The weight of their stares burned into his skin. His legs felt heavy, his movements sluggish, but the grip on his arms was relentless, forcing him forward. They took him outside, where a military transport vehicle waited. The cool night air did nothing to shake the numbness that had settled over him. The moment he was pushed inside, the doors slammed shut behind him, sealing him away from the world. The drive to the detention facility felt both endless and instant. The hum of the engine vibrated through his bones, but he barely registered it. His mind replayed the moment over and over again, the gun in his hand, the shots fired, the way Westbrook's body had collapsed. His breathing, ragged and uneven. The spreading stain of blood. By the time they reached the detention building, his hands had gone numb from the cuffs digging into his wrists. The MPs hauled him out of the vehicle, their grips firm but not rough. There was no need for force, Darius wasn't resisting. He was taken inside, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering above him as he was marched through a series of sterile hallways. They led him to a holding cell, a small concrete room with nothing but a metal cot bolted to the wall. The door clanged shut behind him, the heavy lock sliding into place with a dull finality. He was alone. The silence pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. His pulse thrummed in his ears, loud in the empty space. He sat down on the cot, his muscles aching from the tension that had held them rigid for too long. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. He wasn't sure. Time had lost all meaning. At some point, an officer arrived. He spoke, but Darius barely heard him. The words blurred together: charges, military tribunal, maximum sentencing. The gravity of it should have crushed him, but he felt strangely detached, as if he were watching someone else's life unravel before his eyes. The official version of events solidified quickly. A soldier had shot his superior officer in cold blood. A violent attack. An unforgivable act. No one asked for his side of the story. No one wanted to hear it. But something shifted in the days that followed. At first, it was nothing more than murmurs, hushed conversations exchanged in corners of the barracks. Then came the questions. Quiet, uncertain, but growing. And then, the voices. Female soldiers. One by one, they started speaking. Not in the open, not where others could hear. But in the privacy of whispered conversations and stolen moments where no superiors were listening. They had seen the way Westbrook acted. They had experienced it themselves. They knew the kind of man he was. Darius didn't know it yet, but the silence that had protected Westbrook for so long was starting to crack. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and the weight of unspoken judgments. The military tribunal had been set up inside one of the larger conference halls on the base, its walls stripped bare except for the official banners of the United States Army hanging behind the judge's bench. The rows of seats were filled with uniformed personnel, their faces unreadable as they observed the proceedings with rigid postures and stiff expressions. The press had been barred from entering, but that didn't stop the news from spreading beyond the base's gates. Everyone had heard about the case. Everyone had an opinion. Darius sat at the defense table, his uniform crisp but his body weary from sleepless nights. The chains around his wrists had been removed for the trial, but the feeling of confinement remained. His fingers gripped the edge of the wooden table in front of him, his knuckles taut and pale. Across the room, the prosecution's table was occupied by Major Daniel Harrington, a severe-looking man with neatly combed hair and eyes that carried none of the warmth Darius had once associated with his fellow soldiers. Harrington had made it clear from the start that he intended to see this case through to its harshest possible conclusion. The trial opened with the prosecution's argument. Harrington wasted no time establishing Darius as an unstable and dangerous recruit, someone who had lashed out against his commanding officer in a violent act of insubordination. He painted a picture of Westbrook as a decorated officer, a man who had dedicated his life to the military, only to be gunned down in his own office by a soldier under his command. The words were cold, methodical, designed to elicit outrage from those listening. Witnesses were called. Several officers who had worked with Westbrook took the stand, their voices steady as they spoke of his leadership, his years of service, his reputation for discipline. They described him as a firm but fair commander, a mentor to many. None of them acknowledged the whispers that had long followed him, the quiet warnings passed between recruits. Either they truly believed in the version of Westbrook they were presenting, or they were too afraid to say otherwise. When it was time for the prosecution's key witness, the courtroom fell silent as a psychologist took the stand. Dr. Alan Reeves had been assigned to evaluate Darius after his arrest. He spoke in a calm, measured voice, detailing his assessment of Darius's mental state. He described him as a soldier with unresolved aggression, someone who had exhibited troubling behavioral patterns under stress. He suggested that Darius's actions were not the result of self-defense, but of an emotional breakdown triggered by the pressures of military life. Darius clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to react. He had never met Dr. Reeves before his arrest. The evaluation had been nothing more than a brief, impersonal conversation behind a locked door. And yet, Here he was, being dissected like a specimen, his entire character reduced to a handful of clinical terms that made him sound dangerous. Then it was the defense's turn. Gabrielle Monroe, Darius's attorney, rose from her seat with controlled precision. She was a civilian lawyer, brought in by an advocacy group that had taken an interest in his case. Where the prosecution had leaned on structure and discipline, Monroe wielded truth like a weapon. She started by dismantling the image of Westbrook that the prosecution had so carefully constructed. She presented old personnel records, highlighting instances where complaints had been filed against him, complaints that had mysteriously never led to formal investigations. She called former soldiers to the stand, women who had served under Westbrook and left the military under circumstances that had never been fully explained. One by one, they spoke. A former private, now working as a civilian contractor, described the way Westbrook had targeted her early in her enlistment, singling her out with unwanted attention. When she had tried to request a transfer, she had suddenly found herself reassigned to undesirable duties, her evaluation scores dropping with no explanation. Another woman, a former sergeant, recounted the night she had been called to his office late after hours. The details of her story mirrored Darius's in chilling ways: the locked door, the veiled threats, the sense of powerlessness. Unlike Darius, she hadn't fought back. She had left the military instead, forced out under vague allegations of misconduct. The prosecution objected multiple times, claiming that none of this was relevant to the case at hand, but Monroe pressed on. She painted a picture not of a rogue soldier attacking his superior, but of a young man trapped in a system that had failed to protect him. A system that had ignored complaints, buried evidence, and protected predators like Westbrook at the expense of those they victimized. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the witnesses called to the stand was a junior officer, a lieutenant who had served directly under Westbrook for years. Unlike the others, she was still active duty. Her uniform was neatly pressed, her posture rigid as she took her place before the court. But her voice trembled as she spoke. She confirmed that she had seen the way Westbrook operated. She had watched as young recruits were pulled into his orbit, as promising soldiers were either molded under his influence or discarded when they refused to comply. She admitted that she had never reported anything, that she had been too afraid to risk her own career. When Monroe asked why she had decided to come forward now, the lieutenant hesitated before answering. Then, her gaze flickered toward Darius. Because he had done what she never could. The shift in the courtroom was almost palpable. The officers who had sat with arms crossed, their expressions unreadable, now looked uncertain. Even some of the jury members, a panel of ranking military officials, exchanged glances. The weight of evidence had become too much to ignore. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was finally delivered. Darius was found guilty of assaulting a superior officer. The charge of attempted murder was dismissed, with the court acknowledging that his actions had been taken under extreme circumstances. The sentence was severe but not life-destroying, discharge from the military, but no prison time. The decision was met with mixed reactions. For some, it was too lenient. For others, it was a long overdue recognition of the abuses that had been ignored for years. As Darius stood, listening to the ruling, he felt an odd sense of relief. His career in the military was over. The dream he had chased since childhood had been ripped away. But he was still standing. And for the first time in months, he wasn't standing alone. The silence that had protected Westbrook had been broken. And the system would never be the same again. The story spread faster than Darius could have ever imagined. What had begun as a military court-martial, buried within the confines of Fort Ridge, had exploded onto the national stage. His name appeared in headlines, sometimes as a cautionary tale, sometimes as a symbol of defiance. News outlets dissected every detail of the case. Some painted him as a violent soldier who had disgraced his uniform, while others called him a whistleblower, a man who had dared to challenge the unspoken codes of silence within the military. Investigative journalists seized upon the trial transcripts, searching for cracks in the official narrative. They began speaking to former soldiers, women who had been dismissed, transferred, or forced into silence under eerily similar circumstances. Their stories painted a damning picture, one that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about Major Westbrook. He had been one of many. The pressure on the Department of Defense mounted. Calls for accountability came from every direction: activist groups, veterans organizations, even some within the military itself. Reluctantly, the Pentagon announced an internal review. What had started as a closed investigation into a single case soon unraveled into something far greater. A special commission was formed, composed of military officials, independent legal experts, and human rights advocates. Their task was to review years of ignored complaints, buried reports, and transferred personnel who had mysteriously vanished from service records. Darius watched it all unfold from a distance. He no longer belonged to the world he had once dreamed of serving. His discharge had been swift, final, leaving him with little more than a collection of folded uniforms and a service record that would forever carry the stain of his court-martial. Returning to civilian life had been disorienting. The structure, the order, the sense of belonging that had once defined his existence was gone. He had no rank, no chain of command, no orders to follow. For months, he drifted, unsure of what came next. But his name had become something larger than himself. Advocacy groups reached out, asking him to speak, to lend his voice to the growing conversation about abuse within the military. At first, he refused. He had spent years trying to survive within the system, only to be cast out the moment he fought back. What did he have left to offer? Then the first reforms were announced. Several high-ranking officers were dismissed following the commission's findings. Investigations revealed a pattern of systemic cover-ups stretching back years. Some had ignored complaints. Others had actively participated in the abuse. A few had quietly resigned before formal charges could be filed. The military's long-standing policies on sexual harassment and abuse were overhauled. Complaints could no longer be handled solely within the chain of command. Independent review boards were created. Training programs were redesigned, shifting the burden away from victims and onto the system itself. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was a beginning. And Darius realized that his voice still mattered. He agreed to an interview. Then another. Soon, he found himself standing before audiences, students, journalists, veterans, young recruits who had just begun their own journeys into the military. He didn't speak like a politician or an activist. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He simply told the truth. He spoke about the fear, the silence, the way the system had made him feel powerless even when he had been at his strongest. He told them about the moment he had realized that there would never be justice for him, that all he had left was the choice to fight back or be consumed by the weight of what had happened. Years passed. The world moved on. New scandals emerged. New names replaced his in the headlines. But the echoes of his case remained. 5 years after his discharge, Darius found himself standing in front of a crowded lecture hall at a university in Washington, D.C. The students before him were young, their faces expectant, some filled with quiet skepticism, others with admiration. They weren't soldiers. They hadn't lived through what he had. But they had heard his story, and they wanted to know why he had done what he did. He adjusted the microphone, his fingers steady. He no longer felt the nervousness that had once gripped him when he spoke publicly. The fear was gone, burned away by the years of telling and retelling his own truth. He told them about the man he had been at 22, the young soldier who had believed in the institution, and its promises of honor and integrity. He told them about the first time he had felt Westbrook's presence behind him, about the way the air had shifted, the way his own instincts had screamed at him to run. He told them about the moment he had realized that no one was coming to save him. He didn't describe the gunshots. He didn't need to. That part of the story had been dissected enough times in courtrooms, in articles, and late-night television debates where strangers had argued about whether he had acted in self-defense or out of rage. Instead, he told them about what came after. He told them about the silence breaking. When he finished speaking, the room remained quiet for a long moment. Then, a hand went up. A young woman in the front row. She asked him if he regretted what he had done. Darius considered the question. He thought about the life he might have had, the careers that had been stripped from him, the uniform he had once worn with pride. He thought about the moments of doubt, the nights when he had wondered if it would have been easier to endure, to survive quietly, to let things happen as they had for so many others before him. Then he met her gaze. "No," he said. And for the first time in years, he felt the absolute certainty of his own answer. He had not been a hero. He had not set out to change anything. But the silence was broken. And that was enough.